Funding for this program was provided by the National Institute of Justice.
Punishment, 19 years, Texas Department of Corrections.
Hello, I'm James Wilson. A large number of Americans think drugs should be legalized. If drugs were legal, there would be less crime and neighborhoods would be safer. Many others disagree. They say legalizing drugs would create more addicts and destroy more lives. Holland has taken some steps to make the use of some drugs legal. Soft drugs such as marijuana and hashish have been decriminalized. And even though laws forbid the sale of heroin and cocaine, these drugs are available without much official interference on Amsterdam's streets. Welcome to Amsterdam. The cosmopolitan capital of the Netherlands attracts many tourists with its picturesque canals that traverse the city and abundant clean parks. But like many cities throughout the world, Amsterdam is grappling with the problem of illegal drugs. The current guidelines on hard drugs call for criminal investigation and prosecution of drug traffickers only. There are no criminal proceedings against users. With soft drugs, the small dealers, as well as the users, are left undisturbed by the police. Marijuana and hashish are available at many coffee shops. Heroin and cocaine can be bought openly on some Amsterdam street corners. Although most of the Dutch are not happy with their current policy, there is no consensus about how to change it. No one wants dealers and addicts hanging around their own neighborhood. On one side are those who favor legalization of all drugs, arguing that this would get addicts off the street and reduce criminal activity.
I've heard a lot of these people say, why don't you legalize it so that we can get rid of the problem? Because if you legalize it, then, you know, then my car will be safe, my radio will be safe, my home is not going to be burglarized anymore. There's, you know, we're not going to have many more petty thefts and other forms of crime. And I think these people are wrong.
Jay Blau was chief of police in Rotterdam until his retirement in 1988.
But I think it's absolutely wrong to suggest that petty crime or crime as a whole would go if you would legalize it, because as far as the addicts are concerned, they would still go out stealing.
Present drug policy leads to an illegal market in which substances are sold of a very poor and unreliable quality and of a high price, which means additional health problems for users, which means drug-related crime, which means overburdened criminal justice system agencies.
H. von Maastricht, a coordinator for the European movement for the normalization of drug policy, argues that complete legalization would unburden the criminal justice system and reduce health risks for addicts.
Those problems are not connected to heroin. Heroin doesn't lead to prostitution. Cocaine doesn't lead to criminality. Drug policy leads to criminality, and drug policy leads to prostitution.
If we should legalize the hard drugs totally, it would affect the group or the number of hard drug addicts seriously. I think it's a disaster.
G. Penning is an addiction therapist in Amsterdam. Although he opposes complete legalization, he is in favor of providing drugs to some of Holland's 20,000 hard drug addicts. Penning cites Dutch experiments with about 50 addicts who were given free morphine in exchange for living more responsibly.
It was successful because if you give these drugs, you can ask something. You can ask them to clean their house. You can ask them to find a house. You can ask them to take contact of the family. So if there is a change, if there is a possibility to negotiate, then it's successful.
All sides in the current Dutch dispute cite the failure in the United States to maintain its prohibition of alcohol that began in 1917 and ended 16 years later.
Now, after 50 years of that period, we think it generally stupid to have developed such a kind of policy towards alcohol problems. In my view, in about 50 years, people will think the same of this period of prohibition of cocaine, heroin, and so on. It has caused only more problems than the problems directly related to the use of that substance.
If a country like the Netherlands would decide to legalize, which I'm sure is not going to happen, I'm pretty convinced of that, but if it would, then what can you expect but extra trains and aeroplanes and buses of people coming out this way, to get the drugs and then take them back to their own country?
The Dutch generally agree that the decriminalization of soft drugs, marijuana and hashish, did not increase the number of users.
The number of addicts for soft drugs in Holland is stabilized. We try to decriminalize the use of soft drugs by arresting only the big dealers, and we let the little users do what they want to do. And I think it's a good policy.
But Penning says it does not follow that hard drugs should be legalized.
We should not legalize the selling of hard drugs in Holland. I think that's very stupid. The effect on younger children, on the youth in general, will be disastrous. We know which people are the hard drug users, and let's specialize this legalization for them, not for others.
We know at present that current drug policy is unable to prevent the use of substances. The only instrument which can be effective in this respect is prevention programs, education of children, education of people in general. You have to learn children and people to behave in traffic. Traffic is a risky behavior. So is drug taking. So you have to make programs for children to use drugs safely.
Either you fight or you surrender. But when we decide that we're going to fight, we should fight united. The drug problem is not an Amsterdam or Rotterdam problem, is not a Dutch problem, is not a Western European problem, it's a worldwide problem.
With me to discuss these matters are Dr. Herbert Kleber, Deputy Director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy, and Ethan Nadelmann, Assistant Professor at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University. Professor Nadelmann, you have spoken out as an advocate of legalization. What exactly do you mean by legalization of drugs?
Jim, legalization has many meanings. To some, it's a slogan that means take the crime out of the drug business. And to some extent, as you said, it would do that. To some, it's a rallying cry that brings together people from across the political spectrum in the same way that repeal prohibition did 60 years ago. People from George Shultz and Milton Friedman and William Buckley on the right to the mayors of Baltimore and Hartford, Connecticut, and the ACLU on the left, and many other people in the middle, from police chiefs to prosecutors to treatment people. It's also, and it's primarily, in fact, a framework of analysis. What legalization is in 1990 is an approach that says, let's look at current drug prohibition policies. Let's see what are their costs, what are their benefits. Let's compare those with the costs and benefits of other prohibition policies and other legalization policies, and choose the policy which is most successful. The conclusion we come to is that a policy which emphasizes public health approaches and the rights of individuals over criminal justice approaches is, in all likelihood, going to be the more successful policy.
If that is what you mean by legalization with respect to a drug such as cocaine, emphasizing the public health approach, wouldn't that emphasis and the withdrawal of, to some degree, criminal sanctions lead to a dramatic increase in cocaine or heroin consumption?
No, I don't think so. I mean, for two reasons. Three reasons, in fact. One is simply that it's not an all-or-nothing alternative. It's not as if all of a sudden we have to go to a libertarian scenario of free cocaine and 7-Elevens to be sold everywhere. It's a step-by-step process. Where I disagree with the Rotterdam's police chief's last words was he said the drug problem is an international problem. That's true on some level, but it's primarily a local problem. Cocaine is a local problem that needs local solutions. What I'm calling for with legalization, what most other people are as well, are local approaches to local problems. That means that Newark should experiment with one policy, neighborhoods in LA with something else, Chicago with something else, suburbs with something else. Each one should see what works. Because remember, what should be the objective of a good drug policy? Is it to create a drug-free society? No, that's ludicrous. There's never been such a thing in history, except maybe the Eskimos, right? The objective of a good drug policy should be to do two things. It should be to reduce the extent of all drug abuse, both legal and illegal drug abuse, and secondly, to reduce the costs and harms caused by drug prohibition. And I think a policy that focuses on public health approaches as opposed to criminal justice approaches is more likely to do that.
Suppose we adopted the strategy of finding out what works in different communities. We saw the person in Holland remark with respect to legalization there that if Holland took the next step of general legalization, there would be trainloads of people coming from other countries. If some community in the United States, Newark or Hartford, took that step, wouldn't we see that other people elsewhere in the United States would go there and the problem would spread?
That's already happening now. People from around Europe are already coming to Holland because of its policies. In fact, the majority of the overdose deaths there each year are foreigners, are not Dutch citizens. People already flock to New York and to Miami and to what other cities happen to have the most drugs available. So would you continue to have intra-U.S. smuggling under a legalization scenario? Sure. But the fact is most drug users and even dealers don't tend to move all that far. In the end, drug problems vary dramatically. Why is it that Honolulu is flooded with ice? Chicago had almost no crack. Miami has almost no heroin. Very local problems that need different solutions. Does legalization mean that you make crack or cocaine legally available in a place where there's no market for it to begin with? Not necessarily. But does it mean that in a neighborhood where the police year after year have failed to eradicate or even significantly reduce the presence of illicit drugs, does it mean that there maybe the government should step in and provide those drugs together with treatment programs and positive resources instead? Well, yes, maybe that is what it means.
Let's take that case. Suppose we have a neighborhood that has been for a long period of time besieged with cocaine use, and let's suppose this neighborhood is one where the police have made little impact on drug use. If the government were to supply or remove the sanctions from cocaine use in that neighborhood, would that lead in that neighborhood to a dramatic increase in the level of addiction?
No, I don't think so.
Why not?
Because I think in precisely those neighborhoods where drugs are already available. Look at it this way. What does drug prohibition accomplish? Right? Basically three things. It should decrease the availability, increase the price of drugs, and the criminal sanction should deter some people. So maybe that makes a difference in Princeton or other suburban communities. But look at the inner cities. Drugs are dramatically available everywhere, have been so for decades. Secondly, the price. Well, the price of some drugs like heroin is high, but crack is incredibly cheap and other drugs are very cheap. So the price effect. Thirdly, criminal sanction. So far as I can tell, and when you look in the inner cities and look at those people who have not gotten involved with illicit drugs in the inner cities, it's not so much because of the laws as because they had positive things going for them. They had a good family, they found a good teacher or a good mentor, maybe they saw what drugs did to their older brother.
Let me interrupt at this point and get Dr. Kleber's views on this. Professor Nadelmann has said that in effect that there are neighborhoods where drug use could not now be worse than it is under an alternative policy. Do you agree that we have, with our present policies, failed to discourage drug use?
I think that there are some areas where we're not as successful as we are in others, but I think overall, if you begin to look at what's happening across the country, that clearly the tide is turning, that in many communities, the police and the people in those communities are taking back their streets, taking back their neighborhoods. And what we're finding is that indeed our policies are beginning to have an effect and the tide is turning.
If the tide is turning, isn't it turning slowly? We see reports of so much crime and gang violence associated with the illegal sale of drugs. Wouldn't legalization, somehow defined by taking the profit out of it, reduce this crime and violence?
There are three kinds of crime connected with drugs. The crime involved in peddling drugs, the crime involved in getting the funds to buy the drugs, and the crime connected because of the psychopharmacologic effects of the drug. The only crime that might go down a bit would be the crime connected with distributing the drugs. And even then it wouldn't go away altogether, because no matter how you legalize it, and I noticed that Ethan never really said what a legalization scheme would look like, and that's the main problem of the whole legalization movement. They never really defined what legalization would look like. But no matter what scheme you have, whether Newark has a different one than New York City, no one's going to legalize cocaine for the under 21 group. So you're still going to have some illegal activity. So that crime will go down, but not totally. The crime connected to getting the funds for drugs is going to increase, because the total number of people using drugs like cocaine is going to sharply rise. And they're still going to need money for food, shelter, cars, whatever. So the total crime is going to go up. Crime in Amsterdam is not going down. It is going up. And finally, the last kind of crime is going to sharply rise. Cocaine is a drug that produces irritability, aggression, paranoia, and that leads to violence. And so as the number of users rise, you can have much more in a way of violence connected simply by people using that drug.
Isn't it the case, however, that when the drugs are illegal, they're often sold in a poisoned or adulterated or suspect form, and that some of the misbehavior, some of the deaths, some of the illness we see associated with drug use may come from its illegal and thus adulterated nature?
That's been less of an issue with cocaine than it was with heroin.
Why is that?
The way that cocaine is used, for example, in the smoking form. The adulterants don't have much effect unless you're using the Pasuco from South America, where you get into the kerosene and that. But most of the impurities with crack don't affect people the same way that impurities such as strychnine or whatever affected heroin use. So that is not a major issue in the casualties from the drug war. Most of the casualties are totally related to the effects of the drug.
The gentleman we saw from Holland, and indeed many Americans, believe that prohibition failed, and that is the main lesson we should learn in thinking about drug policy today. Do you believe that the prohibition on alcohol use in this country did in fact fail?
First of all, the prohibition wasn't against use. It was against manufacture and distribution. And it did not fail if you look at use. What you find is that during Prohibition, cirrhosis of the liver dropped 2/3, alcoholism significantly dropped, so that if that was your goal, Prohibition certainly was a success.
But didn't Prohibition also create at the same time large, in fact in some cases nationwide, criminal gangs that by profiting off the illegal sale of alcohol were able to constitute, after Prohibition, a continuing threat to American society?
One of the key lessons of Prohibition that really says we should not change the legal status of drugs like cocaine and heroin is that when you have a drug that is freely available and you have many people in society saying, I want to continue using it, it's hard once you've had that for a number of years to turn around and say, okay, we're going to now make that illegal for you to get. So that's why you had the rise of those gangs, because the majority of Americans wanted to continue to drink. Whereas the majority of Americans will not use cocaine and heroin as long as it's illegal.
Or if it's legal, for that matter. But yeah, go ahead, Jim.
Well, let me ask you the following question. There seems to be a key factual disagreement here as to whether legalization somehow defined would or would not increase cocaine use. Dr. Kleber says yes, you say no. Why do you differ?
Well, look at it this way. We differ, for example, on the interpretation of Prohibition and what lessons can be learned. Was drinking and alcoholism less during Prohibition than before or after? Yes, it was. When did most of the decline happen? Before Prohibition was instituted and right at the beginning, as a result not just of Prohibition laws, but of anti-alcohol sentiment and the proselytizing of the temperance movement and anti-German sentiment during World War I because they were involved with distilleries and such. But the second lesson is to look at what Britain did at the same time. During World War I, Britain wanted to reduce alcoholism, alcohol-related ills as well. They looked at the U.S., they considered Prohibition, and they rejected that option. What they did instead was a much more restrictive legal policy. They taxed the hell out of booze. They limited the hours that pubs could be open. They had vigorous anti-alcohol campaigns. What happened in Britain? They reduced drinking, cirrhosis of the liver, alcohol-related ills far more than the United States did. They did it at the same time that they raised billions of pounds in revenue, and they did it without shoving the whole business into the hands of organized and unorganized criminals.
Herbert Kleber has made the point, however, that prohibition in the United States was supported by public opinion, and then public opinion changed, but public opinion always has supported some level of personal alcohol use, but it is not, so far as we can tell, supported cocaine use. Is it therefore really realistic to talk about legalization when the public is against it, or are you simply offering this as an argument? Do you expect this could happen?
Well, Jim, it's really both. I think that the key value of legalization right now is in pointing out the costs of the current system. I mean, let's remember the real analogy to alcohol prohibition is in the costs of prohibition. When right now we have 40% of all the people in federal prisons are there on drug offenses. Not drug-related charges, it's drug offenses. That population is going to double and it'll be 50%. When between a quarter and half of all the felony indictments in major urban courts are on drug charges, over 50% in Washington, D.C. That's a cost. When close to $20 billion in 1990 will be spent just enforcing drug laws, that's a cost.
Let me give Dr. Kleber a chance to respond. He is saying the costs outweigh the benefits of the present system, and you disagree. How do you assess those costs? How do you assess those benefits?
What we're seeing is a beginning of the turning down. Ethan is right. There is a lot of money being spent to imprison people who are selling and using drugs. However, what we're finding is that that number is beginning to change. Casual use of drugs is dropping. And as that use drops, what you're going to find is the number of addicts begins to drop. You're going to find that the number of criminals using drugs begins to drop. We're beginning to see that now with the studies of drug use among arrestees. That has leveled off and is beginning to drop. We're seeing significant drops in drug use among people coming to emergency rooms. So that we're seeing now a turn down in the casualties, and I think what we're seeing is that the epidemic has peaked, and that the worst thing in the world would be to change it when we're beginning to win.
Let me ask you on this point. We have, in effect, in this country, decriminalized the private use and possession of marijuana in perhaps a dozen states. Has that led, in the states that have decriminalized it, to a greater use of marijuana, or has it had no effect?
Well, you take Alaska. In Alaska, 4 ounces of marijuana is legal for personal use. Marijuana has roughly double the marijuana use rate of any other state.
Alaska does.
Alaska does. It's about 54%. So I think that's an example of what happens when you basically decriminalize.
Do you agree in the analysis of marijuana?
Yes, marijuana use is higher in Alaska, so is alcohol use. Any place where the sun shines for 24 hours a day for months on end and it's dark for 24 hours a day tends to have higher levels of alcohol abuse and also other sorts of things. Look at Iceland. Iceland has a level that makes Alaska pale in comparison. The more important thing is, Herb says we're turning the corner. You can see the light at the end of the tunnel. There's 2 things about that. The first is we've been hearing that for the last 20 and 30 years. I mean, Richard Nixon, every president and every administration has declared that, much like they did with the Vietnam War. You know, you go into office for a year or 2, all of a sudden you say you're making progress, leave office, and a new problem emerges and it keeps going. All right, so that's not working. The second point, though, is that Herb says that, in fact, we are winning this war. Well, the key successes, as far as I can tell, in the last 5 years have been in reducing the number of college kids and yuppies using drugs like marijuana and cocaine. Precisely the people who were least likely to have problems with their drug use. At the same time, the most horrible costs of drug abuse, which are drug-related AIDS and crack babies, the more severe inner-city drug use, by all indications is getting worse and worse. Our current policies are responsible for that in good part.
Let me ask Dr. Kleber about 2 things that you've just mentioned. First, is it the case, as Ethan says, that many people, he mentioned yuppies, he probably has in mind others, can safely use cocaine without it developing the kind of problems we associate with serious drug abuse? And secondly, that the problem of crack babies has somehow been a consequence of our present policy?
I think it's dangerous to say that anyone can safely use cocaine. I've seen plenty of cocaine addicts among lawyers, business people, the so-called yuppies that Ethan described. Cocaine is the most addictive drug that I've ever encountered, and it can affect people in the inner city who have no education. It can affect people who are highly educated. It is an equal opportunity addictive drug. If cocaine were freely available, we would see more in the way of crack babies. There's no way you're going to have less of it. You're going to have more. You're going to have more in the way of fatal auto accidents. A recent study showed that 25% of all the auto fatalities in New York City, the drivers had cocaine in their blood. That's going to increase. You're going to see more cocaine use in the inner city, not less.
All right. Now let me just press on this one bit. We've been talking about cocaine, and you feel strongly about this. How far would you go in endorsing the view that the government has a responsibility to protect people from themselves? You feel that it should protect people from their inadvertent or miscalculated use of cocaine and perhaps also heroin. Is this a policy that you would extend to all drugs, some drugs, just a few drugs?
Well, John Stuart Mill, who is probably the best philosopher on the various forms of liberty and freedom, talked about that one of the exceptions he makes to people being essentially as free as you can make them is relating to addicting drugs, that addicting drugs enslave. And it makes it hard for people to achieve that kind of freedom that he was talking about. So I think that government in that area of these dangerous drugs has a role in keeping people from using these drugs. The legalizers often say, well, look, nicotine is legal, alcohol is legal. Well, nicotine is legal. We've made progress in decreasing it. 55 to 60 million Americans are addicted to nicotine.
All right, let me turn to Ethan Nadelmann here for a moment. You have not really outlined a specific policy for a legalization regime. If you were mayor of Newark or Hartford or pick any other city where the mayor has already suggested that we consider legalization, what concretely would you do in that position?
I'd begin with 3 steps. I'd begin with a legalization of marijuana. I'd begin with a tougher policy on alcohol and tobacco. And at the third time, I would begin with more expansive drug prevention and drug treatment programs. I would cut the budget on enforcement and spend that money on Head Start programs and pre- and postnatal care, because more and more evidence shows that dollar for dollar, those are the most effective drug abuse prevention programs we know of. I would look at Europe. I would look at Zurich, where they're setting up a drug-free zone. I would look at Holland, where they have the policies that were described, not fully there, but policies, outreach programs, methadone buses, programs to reduce the harms of drug abuse. I would look at Liverpool and the Merseyside region in England, where not just methadone is prescribed, not just oral methadone, but even injectable methadone, injectable heroin, and even smokable cocaine. Maintenance policies.
Okay. He should also, while he's at it, look at Italy.
All right,
which has basically decriminalized heroin for personal use and has the highest addiction rate and highest death rate from heroin of any country in Western Europe. It's absurd to think that prevention and treatment is going to decrease efficiently drug use. It's much harder to do prevention and treatment when drugs are legal and freely available.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid we're going to have to end. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching. For Crime File, this is James Wilson.
Crime File is a production of CF Productions Incorporated, which is solely responsible for its content. Funding for this program was provided by the National Institute of Justice, research arm of the U.S. Department of Justice.